Welcome to episode 2 in our segmented series. I've been sitting here sanding segments and getting ready to build my first ring. So today's episode is all about ring assembly, and there are multiple ways to do that. I'm going to show you 3 different techniques. The one which we should be able to use, which is a result of having marked these things properly and to have used the wedgie sled and having sanded every edge to be sure all burrs are gone. A burr can roll down into the joint and spoil the assembly. So here's one with a mark on the outside, inside, out, in, and so on. The point is that these pieces need to alternate in the assembly. And what I'm going to do next, I'm going to put a clamp around it and dry fit them temporarily. And the purpose of this dry fit is simply to check to see how well these go together. So I've tightened the clamp. I'm making sure all the pieces are square and flat. And what I'm going to do next, and you won't be able to see it, but you'll have to do this yourself. I'm going to hold this up to one of the lighting fixtures that we're using here to film, and I'm going to look through the ring while wiggling it to see if I can see any gaps. If I see a gap, this won't go together this way. I didn't see any, which is what I expected because that sled we have. So I'm going to loosen the clamp. And I'm going to glue these pieces together, and we will have formed this ring. So let me just give myself a little working room here. What I have here is a piece of, this is actually stainless steel. We were fortunate enough to have somebody cut and give them to us. I have cleaned the surface best I could, and I put a heavy coat of just cheap old paste wax. I don't remember what the brand is, but it's the cheapest one I could find at the hardware store. Wax this good. That means that the ring, once it's glued up, won't end up sticking to the surface. For glue, I'm using Titebond Original. I tend to use that for all the pieces. So what I'm going to do is just do a quick glue up here. I don't put glue on every piece. I don't think I need to. So I'm going to put glue on this piece, and I'm going to put one on each side of it. It puts glue on both joints. So I'll put glue here and here. Be liberal with your glue. Glue's cheap. A starved joint is not a good thing. And any glue that's left over after the ring has been glued up, we will end up turning away or sanding off. So there's almost a whole ring. I'm not going to show you each ring, but once you see one done, you'll know how this one goes. So now, there's 12 pieces, or soon to be 12 pieces. And I need a flat surface. And I have my clamp here. This is one of these quick release clamps, which makes it really nice to get it down to size. And my driver. Now before I put too much pressure on it, I'm going to stop and be sure all these corners are lined up properly and it's not stuck on the clamp someplace. See, I'm popping a couple of them around as I go. Finish tightening that up. So this ring is done. And at some point in time after that glue dries, probably 20 minutes, 30 minutes, I can take the clamp off. But that one's done. This is ring number 2. I glued it earlier. And I wanted to show you something else here. This is a series of clamps that I bought at the local hardware store. And because it didn't fit, I took two of these clamps and fasten them together. Did the job. Here's the trick. If you go to the hardware store and buy these, check this surface here. They come from different manufacturers, and different manufacturers don't make them to the same tolerance. So if you're going to connect two together to make a different size, they need to be from the same manufacturer. So as you go through the bins of different size band clamps, just look at the logo. Whatever the logo is here, it should also be here. That means that the two can be connected together to make a larger ring. So I have whole collections of different sizes. So that's one technique. Set that aside. Occasionally, we take the pieces and we try to glue them together, and they don't fit. So we do what's called a half ring technique, and here's an example. I've glued 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 together, and 7 through 12 has been glued together, and I simply put a dowel in between these two halves and then clamp it. What happens is these 6 form together finally, and these form together, and any error is driven to this pivot point. What that means is I'm going to sand these after they've been glued. I'm going to take the band clamp off, and I'm then going to flatten these two surfaces on a disc sander and then rejoin them, and it'll be perfect. So this is called a half ring technique. It's always available when a piece just doesn't quite fit. So let me show you how that's done. I have a ring here, and I can set all these pieces up, and then I'm going to put these two dowels into place. I'm using fairly large dowels, and the reason is I can set them up on end, and that means that when I'm positioning things around, these things are not going to be moving out of the way. So let me set this up real quick, and I'll be right back as soon as I get all the pieces in the right place. See, here's the top, inside, top, outside, and I just need to arrange them in the right sequence. Outside, inside, inside, out, in, out. A little tedious, but you've got to get them in the right sequence. And this is in. I need an outie. There's my outie, innie, out, in. The other thing I was checking to be sure is I always had the same face up. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It doesn't matter which 6. And 6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue those 6 together, and I'm going to glue these 6 together. Put them in my clamp. So let's get this ring done. The thing to do to remember is don't put glue here. These have to be able to come off the dowels. Just like I did before. There's one side ready to go. 6. Since I glue every other piece, I've got to be conscious of not losing count. Okay. So we get them together. I don't need to check these against the light because I know these pieces may not fit, and that's the whole point of the half ring technique. This is just a demo ring. It's not intended to fit any particular vessel. Let's close the clamp down to approximately the size we need. I have 2 different sources of clamps, and they have different sizes. Okay, now we're getting close. before I go too far, to make sure all the pieces are touching properly, I want to make sure these dowels are in the center of the joint. That means that the air will be transferred properly. If they're on one side, inside or out, what'll end up happening, it could end up torquing the joint even more. Light pressure. Make sure all my pieces are fitting properly. Okay, and I'm going to finish tightening now. And what's going to happen is after this is dry, I'll take this apart, pull these two dowels out, sand this flat on a disc sander, and then glue the two halves back together. So that's a second technique called half-ring method. If you're using a miter gauge or other technique other than the wedgie sled, chances are you will find this technique being used from time to time. You'll have to do that. I'm going to set that aside and we'll go sand it before the video's over. So that's second technique. What if the ring is so small because of your project that you're not able to use a band clamp on it? Like this one. Well, here's a ring. Now I haven't marked any of the pieces on it, and I haven't got all the edges sanded, but let me just do a couple, three of them. But this is so narrow, as you can see, that being able to put a clamp around it's going to be almost impossible. The edges are marked. See, there's the inside mark. There's an outside mark. And because one side is smooth and the other side is bandsawed, I can tell which is top and which is bottom. This is a technique that's called this is called a rub joint. Let me just do 3 or 4 of them here. Okay. So here's how the rub joint works. I'm going to take 2 pieces and I'm going to put a little glue on this one edge. And I'm going to set these 2 down flat in the right position. And I'm going to put them together and I'm going to rub them back and forth. And after about 3 or 4 rubs, I'm going to use my fingertip to be sure these edges are lined up. That has tacked. And after a few minutes, I'll bring this down and I'll add a 3rd piece. Doing this pretty soon here, but it's rubbing these back together, back and forth. And there's a 1/4 of a ring. So let's do another 1/4 ring. Here's an outside piece. A little burr on that one. Let's look for an inside piece. Here's an inside piece. Okay, now what my point is, I want to show you where we go from here. Inside, out, in, out. So here's another 1/4 ring. And I'll do the same thing again. And we're ultimately going to end up with a half ring technique here. I'm going to do these together. Rubbing them together and sliding it back and forth until you'll feel it tack. Got 2 1/4 rings. Now after that glue has set and it's good and dry, I'm going to join the 2 1/4 rings. And I'm going to end up with a half a ring. And that's where I stop. Because at this point, I'm not sure that this is square because my pressure, the amount of glue, all sorts of things could force this to be driven out of alignment. But at this point, I will do the same thing that I do with this half ring method here. I'm going to take this to the disc sander and I'm going to square up this edge and I'm just going to square up that edge and then put the 2 halves together. Half ring method, rub joint technique. Rub joint works great for really thin rings. This applies to almost any size. I could have used rubber bands around here instead of a clamp. That's fine. But there's no way I could have clamped this effectively. And even though this has only been a minute or two, I can manipulate that piece around pretty well already. I could glue up the other half. And what we're going to do now, I'm going to finish this ring. We're going to go to the disc sander, and I'll show you how I sand this. There's a technique of sanding that needs to be managed properly. So let's go to the sander, take this piece over there, and sand it flat and finish the job on this ring. See you at the sander. I'm at the disc sander, and we have a nice one here at the school which I can use, but a 12-inch disc put on the headstock of your lathe will work just fine as long as you can come up with a table that gives you a nice sharp 90 degrees. Now I'm going to test this. First thing I'm going to do before I do anything. First, the sanding disc is fairly new. That's good. Second thing I'm going to do is take a square, put it on the table to be sure this table is as square to the face of this sanding disc as possible. And that looks pretty good. But the only way really to test it is to put a bright light behind it and look on the other side. And I see, because of the grit of the sandpaper, it's the same all the way from the top to the bottom. If that was not perfect, I would have adjusted this table up and down as best I can to get it as near 90 degrees as possible. So I'm going to sand the first ring. And what I'm going to do before I even start to sand it, I'm going to take a pencil. I'm going to put a mark all the way across the face of each side. I've already done it on this one. And I'm going to sand it across the center of the wheel. That means this side right here is being rubbed by the sandpaper at the same pace as this side over here. If I sanded it over here, this side will cut much faster than this because of the way the disc is moving. Always spread it across the center of the disc. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sand this one face up, and this side here I'm going to sand face down. If there is any error in this table, or I push on it, change the angle, these two, when put together, will then fit. So it cancels the error out. So let's do this now. I have my safety glasses on. As you can see, the mark is almost gone. It's done. Now, what you saw was that thing turned off. There's not need to run it at full speed all the time. I don't need a lot of sanding force. On very large sanders, many times we'll turn it on, let it coast down, and then finish the sanding. That side is done. And I'll do the other side, and then I'm going to show you the small ring. This one will be done upside down. Before I do that, I've already accumulated some sawdust here. And I'm going to take my eraser, and I'm going to clean this surface a little bit. So let's do a little cleaning, and then we'll come back and do the other side. Done. one other thing I want to comment on while this is slowing down is, see, the rings are perfect. And I did not even have it running while I was doing the sanding. Now, when I'm sanding across the center, which is the only place I want to do that, be sure that you put pressure on this side to hold it down. The sanding disc is wanting to pull this down against the table here, but it's going to want to try to lift this. So be sure that you always keep a little pressure on the right-hand side so it doesn't get lifted. At this point, I can go back to my sanding table, glue those two pieces back together again, glue these guys back together again, and we will have completed our ring through the half ring method here and through rub joint methods here. Now, from the time I glued these to the time we're filming this portion right here is probably less than 5 minutes. It did not take a long period of time for the glue to tack sufficiently. Now, I'm not torquing these joints a lot either. I'm being very careful with them. But you don't need a long period of time for this glue to set. This has been less than 5 minutes from making this to coming over here to the sanding disc. Okay, so we've done all the techniques now to glue these rings together. I want to show you one other thing. We'll go back to the table and I want to make a little drawing to illustrate why I cut my components a little wider than what the chart we put together in the first section said to do. So let me explain that to you. Back at the table. Okay, we're back from the sander. Here's the two pieces that we sanded. I'm just going to finish it off by gluing these together, which is going to take just a second. And again, we're into this just a few minutes. One of the things that happens sometimes, glue bottles close up the opening when we don't want it to. A little glue on that half. These two pieces push together. Band clamp. Close. It's not perfect yet. Let's check to be sure the joints are good. Yeah, they are. So now I'll finish tightening. And that one's done. Now this one, remember we sanded one side up, one side down, like that. I can tell which side is up because one side is polished and the other side is not. So now I simply have to glue these two together, and I'm back to the rub joint technique again because I can't get a clamp on this. Just rub them back together. Line up the points. My thumb is lining up this corner here. That piece is done. So that's how you glue up the rings. I want to show you one other thing before we finish, and that's going to be why I cut these segments a little wider than the drawing requires. Remember, this is going to be 1/4 inch wall thickness here, but I've done almost twice that in terms of the actual piece. You noticed that when I cut them the other day on the other video. Let me explain that to you. I'm going to bring over a piece of paper. Here's that 60-degree included angle. And let's say we want to do a piece that's this wide up here. Let's just draw it in. This is all arbitrary, just simply for the point of kind of illustrating something. So I've measured the distance, and that's the diameter, or radius in this case, of the piece I want to turn. And from the drawing, it said it ought to be this thick. And we were measuring right across there. Well, now that isn't going to actually work quite too well. Let's explain why. Let me now shape this outside from this point right here. Here is the circle. So if you see that it works fine here, but down here I'm almost through the outside edge. I need to set my calipers here. This is the width I want. So let's draw that circle in. There's the ring, but in order to encompass that whole piece, the segment has to be literally this wide. It needs to go from here to here, and our flat drawing gives us only this dimension here. So it's not going to be quite wide enough. So we always add a little extra meat to that dimension in order to be able to account for that. Now, if we go into the software that you can buy or acquire, it does all this calculations properly. And if I build a right triangle here, I can always calculate what this dimension has to be, because I know this angle here is 15 degrees. I know this distance here is the radius of the circle, and I need to do the calculation. All I need to know is the tangent of 15 degrees and a little bit of trigonometry, and I can calculate what this distance is subtracted from this distance we got off of our chart, and I'll have another measurement. All you have to really do is either do all these calculations, which you can do, you can buy the software, which you can do, or you can just add a little bit more meat to the sizes. Always add, let me pick a ring here. If I was going to make this bigger, add the meat to the inside of that ring, not to the outside. The outside establishes the dimensions and the shape of the piece that you're making. Anything on the inside I can always turn away when I get down to my wall thickness. So be liberal in that. The other thing is, if this piece is going to be very thin, I may want it thicker just for mechanical support during the process of turning. It's a lot of extra information, but I'm simply saying make it a little wider. Glue up your rings. Next week, next video I should say, what we will be doing is we'll take these rings, we'll have to flatten one side of them, and we're going to glue them up and create our vessel. Base, ring 2, ring 3, ring 4. So we will assemble the vessel and we'll turn it in the next video. See you then.